Good afternoon and welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. I trust you had a good weekend and I trust you're keeping yourself and your family safe and your loved ones. Let me start with some macro thoughts. This was from Thursday actually. US personal spending fell 7.5% in March, the biggest monthly fall in 60 years. That's from Patel FX. And bear in mind that so much of the global economy and the US economy depends on the US consumer. So this is not an unimportant number. What's certain is that the whole global economy has been hit by an insidious, literally invisible circuit breaker, as I said in February. And the virus is not correlated to endogenous market dynamics, but is an exogenous uncertainty that remains unresolved until now. And increasingly, what we're seeing is the Gladwell moment, which arrived in Europe and the United States, and obviously started in China, is now moving quite dramatically into the emerging and frontier markets, and all the data is confirming as much. Look at the renminbi rate, close to a very key level. If this goes, expect a big move in the dollar and potentially a big change in risk assets, says Raoul. And I expect a big blowout now because of the increasing levels in tension, which I will come to momentarily. August last year, I was saying it is the most important currency to watch. Our attention was turned a little bit, but keep an eye on that now. Classic consumer confidence is collapsing in most major countries in the Asia Pacific, but not in China. Fabricated data, CCP at its finest, says Tavi Costa. And Tavi also tweeted a few days ago regarding the commodity market complex. Interestingly, this period of Chinese expansion marked one of the worst decades for this market in history. The contradiction between these numbers, presumably more accurate, he means commodity prices, and the numbers created by the Chinese Communist government is undeniable. And I think a lot of the chirruping hosannas need to consider that. Home thoughts, Kenyatta Avenue, 1 a.m. during the curfew, a Bumburu. And indeed, that is typically a very busy road for, at times, less salubrious reasons. And it made me think of how we've moved from a world of hyper-connectedness to a world of quarantine. I came across some great photos on Magnum Photos, Jerome Cecchini, La Défense, Live Lab Production, Paris, France, November 5, 2017. People are trapped in a quarantined psytrance festival on a beach in Panama. This is now the last festival on earth. You can't make it up. Vice UK, there's a video clip. As I said in my article, the way we live now, you felt the land taking you back to what was there 100 years ago, to what had been there always. And Don DeLillo, everything is barely weeks, everything is days, we have minutes to live. There is that sense of mortality. Jerome Cecchini again, Paris 10th Arrondissement, Live Lab Production, Paris, France, November 4, 2017. Magnum Photos again. Utter disaster. This is what I was referencing when I was saying we're seeing the Gladwellian moment reach emerging and frontier markets. This is Manaus, fills mass graves as COVID-19 hits the Amazon. Day and night, the dead are delivered into the tawny Amazonian earth, the latest victims of a devastating pandemic now reaching deep into the heart of the Brazilian rainforest. On Sunday, 140 bodies were laid to rest in Manaus, the jungle-flanked capital of Amazonas state. They were just dumped there like dogs, he said. What are our lives worth now? Nothing. We aren't in a state of emergency. We're well beyond that. We're in a state of utter disaster. Like a country that is at war and has lost. It's tragic surrealism. I can't stop thinking about Gabriel Garcia Marquez when I think about the situation Manaus is facing. The coronavirus appears to have reached this isolated riverside metropolis of more than 2 million people on March 11, imported by a 49-year-old woman who had flown in from London. 6 weeks later, is taking a terrible toll, with gravediggers so overworked that 2 men were this week forced to bury their own father. With more than 100 people dying each day and Manaus's overwhelmed authorities performing nighttime burials, many fear it is already too late. In Parque Taruma, Manaus's biggest cemetery, excavators have carved out mass graves called trincheras, trenches, in which the dead were being stacked in 3 high piles until a revolt from mourning families saw the practice halted. It's dreadful. All of us are afraid because we don't know what tomorrow might bring, Freitas said. Today we're alive, tomorrow we just don't know. As I said, the zeitgeist of a time is its defining spirit or its mood, and the zeitgeist of 2020, as seen in Manaus, is simply indescribable. This is an aerial view of coffins being buried at an area where new graves have been dug at the Parque Taruma Cemetery in Manaus. That's Getty Images. It's no different in America. Zekwe Clark was in the back pew in the upstairs chapel at the Andrew D. Cleckley Funeral Home in Brooklyn when he chanced to gaze under the coffin and see what looked like a bare foot. You could see it, he later told the Daily Beast. You could actually look under the casket and see it. I asked somebody else, is that a foot? The pastor continued conducting the service as Clark gazed at what was indeed a bare foot visible beneath the hem of the cloth backdrop, closing off the front of the room. It was just bodies on the floor, people on top of each other, he said. The owner, 41-year-old Andrew Cleckley, told police that he had been unable to get cemeteries and crematories to accept enough bodies to keep his facility from overflowing. I'm out of space, he was quoted telling the New York Times. Bodies are coming out of our ears. He noted to himself that there was no air conditioning in the chapel. Not cool, he said, in more than one sense. In regular room temperature like that, what's going to happen? Ours is the most cryptic of centuries, its true nature a dark secret, as Salman Rushdie said. And there is something karmic in this COVID-19. It's invisible, but it is already defeated. The most expensive aircraft carriers lurks everywhere and in silence, and has closed down Mecca, St. Peter's Square, the Vatican, And in a straight contest between coronavirus and bullshit, the coronavirus wins every time. The macabre thing about COVID is that the same demographics are at highest risk whether you open up slowly or quickly, the poor and unhealthy. This is VGR. Only question is whether they die of COVID or destitution and desperation. If you try to minimize deaths, I think they end up being balanced. So we're actually talking about two separate coupled things when we talk about saving the economy: the machine itself and the ownership value of the machine. The early reopened people are wealth savers, machine vandals. The late reopened people are machine savers, wealth vandals. Both are broken. Rich people want to save A and sacrifice a lot of B they don't use. Poor people want to save B and sacrifice a lot of A that they don't use. Save stock values, sacrifice food banks, or sacrifice stock values and save food banks. This is a video from Brazil, video de Corpos al lado de Internados Hospital de Manaus recibe cámara frigofrica para amortos por COVID-19. And it makes you feel there is a fin de siècle, even apocalyptic mood afoot. And another video mostra paciente que aguardava vaga em UTI de Hospital do Am, respirando com saco plástico improvisado por médicos. Let me leave you with two photographs. Herbert List, view out of the window from the apartment of Max Scheller. That was taken in Rome in 1953. And Herbert List, Dance of the Dresses, Travestere, Rome, Italy, 1953. Total confirmed cases, but these surely do not reflect the actual reality: 3.507 million. Total deaths, 247,475 as per Johns Hopkins. Now we have to go back to the beginning. We have to trace every single case. Angela Merkel explains why contact tracing is critical to control the coronavirus epidemic in Germany. It's a short video, DW News. And I tweeted Angela Merkel, every country needs an Angela. Everything else is hocus pocus. Leaders are saying, don't panic, and I want to say, look, chum, you're not Merkel. And just a few days ago, you were telling me it is all cool, it's just the flu. Others might take you seriously, on what basis, I know not, but I don't. And then to quote Jenna Friedman, a reality TV star botched the response to a global pandemic, and now we're all imprisoned in our homes and forced to watch him daily. In case you missed your history subject classes, once upon a time we had the 1903 Maji Maji rebellion in Tanzania. This is Albert Rewea Mamu. And I'll come to Tanzania in a little bit because that is equally macabre now. The motivation could simply be avoiding all-out hot war with China, in which some would naturally expect if they thought we were deliberately attacked with a biological weapon. This is Karen Deluche 111 in response to me saying it clearly looks as if it was an act of war. The motivation could be simply a broader de-escalation strategy. As I said on the 1st of March, there's always more to it. This is what history consists of. It is the sum total of the things they aren't telling us. I was quoting Don DeLillo's book, Libra. And now coronavirus dossier lays out case against China bat virus program. This is from the Daily Telegraph, Australia. China deliberately suppressed or destroyed evidence of the coronavirus outbreak in an assault on international transparency that cost tens of thousands of lives, according to a dossier prepared by concerned Western governments on the COVID-19 contagion. It states that to the endangerment of other countries, the Chinese government covered up news of the virus by silencing or disappearing doctors who spoke out, destroying evidence of it in laboratories, and refusing to provide live samples to international scientists who were working on a vaccine. It can also be revealed the Australian government trained and funded a team of Chinese scientists who belonged to a laboratory which went on to genetically modify deadly coronaviruses that could be transmitted from bats to humans and had no cure, and is not the subject of a probe into the origins of COVID-19. Major themes include the deadly denial of human-to-human transmission, the silencing or disappearing of doctors and scientists who spoke out, the destruction of evidence of the virus from genomic studies laboratories, and bleaching of wildlife market stalls, along with the refusal to provide live virus samples to international scientists working on a vaccine. At least one of the estimated 50 virus samples Dr. Shi has in her laboratory is a 96% genetic match to COVID-19. As she told Scientific American magazine in an article published this week, could they have come from our lab? Since her initial fears, Dr. Shi has satisfied herself the genetic sequence of COVID-19 did not match any her lab was studying, and this is on the basis of her word. The research dossier also references work done by the team to synthesize SARS-like coronaviruses to analyze whether they could be transmissible from bats to mammals. This means they were altering parts of the virus to test whether it was transmissible to different species. They did it with mice, they did it with primates, so therefore you know they've done it. The potential to prepare for and mitigate future outbreaks must be weighed against the risk of creating more dangerous pathogens, they wrote. To examine the emergence potential, that is, the potential to infect humans of circulating bat COVs, we built a chimeric virus encoding a novel zoonotic COV spike protein from the RSCHCO14 COV sequence that was isolated from Chinese horseshoe bats in the context of the SARS-CoV mouse-adapted backbone, the study states. The virus is highly pathogenic, and treatments developed against the original SARS virus in 2002 and the ZMapp drugs used to fight Ebola failed to neutralize and control this particular virus. It examined which proteins were important for interspecies transmission. Bat-borne coronaviruses will cause more outbreaks, she told Scientific American. We must find them before they find us. During this time, Dr. Zhu arranged for wild-caught bats to be transported alive by air from Queensland to the lab in Victoria, where they were euthanized for dissection and studied for deadly viruses. A sensitive but unclassified cable dated January 19, 2018, obtained by the Washington Post, revealed that U.S. Embassy scientists and diplomats in Beijing visited the laboratory and sent warnings back to Washington about inadequate safety practices and management weaknesses as it conducted research on coronaviruses from bats. The intelligence community also concurs with the wide scientific consensus that the COVID-19 virus was not man-made, it was, or genetically modified, it was. As we do in all crises, the community's experts respond by surging resources and producing critical intelligence on issues vital to U.S. national security. Why they're making that assertion is either protecting people like Dr. Fauci, who produced a grant for these experiments, or alternatively wanting to, as Karen said, not call it for what it is, an act of war. The IC will continue to rigorously examine emerging information. South China University of Technology researchers published a study on February 6 that concluded the killer coronavirus probably originated from a laboratory in Wuhan. Safety level may need to be reinforced in high-risk biohazards laboratories. The paper soon withdrawn because it was not supported by direct proofs, according to the author Bo-Tao Ziano. The dossier noted continued to point out that no scientists have confirmed or refuted the paper's findings. The Saturday Telegraph speaks about the suppression and destruction of evidence and points to virus samples order destroyed at genomics labs Wildlife market stalls bleached. The genome sequence not shared publicly. The Shanghai lab closure for rectification. Academic articles subjected to prior review by the Ministry of Science and Technology and Data on asymptomatic silent carriers kept secret. Out of all the doctors, activists, journalists and scientists who have reportedly disappeared after speaking out about coronavirus or criticizing the response of Chinese authorities, no case is more intriguing and worrying than that of Huang Yanling. A researcher at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the South China Morning Post reported rumors swirling on Chinese social media that she was the first to be diagnosed with the disease and was patient zero. Then came her reported disappearance with her biography and image deleted from the Wuhan Institute of Virology's website. Despite evidence of human-to-human transmission from early December, PRC authorities denied it until January 20. The World Health Organization does the same, yet officials in Taiwan raised concerns as early as December 31, as did experts in Hong Kong on January 4. EU diplomats preparing a report on the pandemic. PRC successfully presses Brussels to strike language on PRC disinformation. So it really is, it's a slam dunk. I mean, that's the bottom line. The question is why we are kind of pussyfooting around. This does not detract from the fact that President Trump was grossly negligent, but, there are some serious questions that we need answering here. So whether, in my opinion, whether it was a leak or it was deliberate is an open question. But once it was leaked, if it was, the worldwide propagation was deliberate and an act of war. Interesting article, video tracking down the origin of the Wuhan coronavirus. Take you back to Scott Burke. What are the odds that a SARS-like coronavirus with overlapping genetics from HIV mutated and crossed over into humans? Next door to a laboratory which had been enhancing coronavirus with HIV for over a decade. And conversely, what are the odds it leaked out of the laboratory? 1st of March, if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. That's Thomas Pynchon. And a paranoid is someone who knows a little of what's going on, William Burroughs. Spike mutation pipeline reveals the emergence of a more transmissible form of SARS-CoV-2. To date, we have identified 14 mutations in spike that are accumulating. The mutation spike D614G is of urgent concern. It began spreading in Europe in early February, and when introduced to new regions, it rapidly becomes the dominant form. SARS-CoV-2 is closely related to SARS-CoV. The two viruses share 79% sequence identity, and both use angiotensin-converting enzyme 2, ACE2, as their cellular receptor. However, the SARS-CoV-2 S protein has a 10 to 20-fold higher affinity for ACE2 than the corresponding S protein of SARS-CoV, which is about what Scott was saying. In North America, infections were initiated and established across the continent by the original D614 form, but in early March, the G614 was introduced into both Canada and the USA, and by the end of March, it had become the dominant form in both nations. So, as I said on the 3rd of February, this is about nonlinearity and exponential risks. Interestingly, SARS-CoV-2 detection is more sensitive than nasopharyngeal swabs. Saliva is more sensitive. And that goes back to the fact that the saliva of COVID-19 patients can harbor 500 billion virus particles per teaspoon, and a cough aerosolizes it into a diffuse mist. Kim suddenly appeared, but the paradox is that Kim has not reappeared, because a rudimentary face scan comparison would confirm this is not him. Have a look at these photographs that I'm showing you, and you can see whether it's the teeth or the ears or the shape of the face. So therefore, a new history has started, an age of peace maybe, from the starting point of history, as he wrote in April 2018, but we're yet to find out what exactly is going on, because neither did the sister if you look at it, look like the sister. Currency markets, dollar index 99.372. Euro dollar 109.33. It had a huge run up in the last two sessions, caught me off guard. Airline passenger traffic is still only 5% of normal. That's from Daniel Lacal. And indeed, that confirms that we've gone from a world of hyper-connectedness to a world of quarantine. The drop in worldwide oil consumption in April has been put as high as 35 million barrels per day, 35% of the pre-100 million barrels per day total volume. Who knows what the new normal for oil demand will be once COVID-19 is firmly in the rear-view mirror. This is Bloomberg opinion. And in this article, he's predicting a 5% new normal, 5% reduction. I think that's way too bullish. I tend to agree with the sage of Omaha that it's highly unlikely we're going to return to that hyper-connected world where people were using that many passenger miles. And therefore, we are now entering the twilight zone for a lot of oil producers. Saudi Arabia's stock market slumped more than 7% yesterday after its finance minister stated painful measures are needed, and Moody's cut the outlook to negative on Friday. As I said on the 6th of April, what I do know is this: regime implosion is coming to the oil producers. Demand has created a return to a hyper-connected 100 million barrels per day world is not going to happen for the foreseeable future. And I think the price of crude oil is perfectly correlated to the sudden stop that we're currently witnessing, and which Bill Gates said about the coronavirus has started to behave a lot like the once-in-a-century pathogen we've all been worried about. Gold, you know, I'm very bullish. We're at $1,700. We've been doing a lot of work below the 1736 double top level, but we're going to go through that. Don't worry. This is just unprecedented. And ABC and Elliott Wave is meaningless, frankly. I think we're headed to 2,000 and above. They're very big short positions, but the nature of short positions is they've got to be covered eventually. 24th of February, I said the viral moment has arrived. At this point, I would venture gold is correlated to the coronavirus, which is set to turn parabolic and is already non-linear and exponential. 22nd of March, I reiterated my thinking that gold will soon turn viral. Emerging markets, the trajectories of non-resident portfolio flows between China and emerging markets, ex-China, has been disjointed for the previous weeks. An example of the cascading effect of this COVID-19 shock, that's from Econ Chart. More recently, this divergence seems to be closing. This is what I would call the China emerging markets frontier feedback loop phenomenon. And I said this phenomenon was positive for the last 2 decades, but has now undergone a trend reversal. The Rand is the purest proxy for that phenomenon, and African countries heavily dependent, and others, on China being the main taker, like Brazil, are also at the bleeding edge of this phenomenon. The pressure point will not ease soon, but will continue to intensify, I said. October last year, I was writing about the new economy of anger. I was quoting Paul Virilio, who said in his book Speed and Politics, the revolutionary contingent attains its ideal form not in the place of production, but in the street, where for a moment it stops being a cog in the technical machine and itself becomes a motor machine of attack. In other words, a producer of speed. Look at this. A demonstration in Lebanon has recreated the Ghanaian dance funeral meme to announce the death of the local currency, which is off more than 60% since late last year. Let's move on to Africa. Zimbabwe's President Mnangagwa and Mozambique President Filipe Nyusi met over the weekend and discussed the security situation in Moz. This is what a presidential summit looks like in the COVID era. Masks 1.5 meters apart, no handshakes or hugs. China's expensive bet on Africa has failed. This is in the Nikkei Asian Review. Ming Sin Pei is professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. As the prices of oil, copper and minerals found in Africa have plunged in the global economic meltdown, the prospects for China-funded projects look bleak. Even the crown jewel of China's economic engagement with Africa, the $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure program, is at risk. It is doubtful that Beijing will have the resources to fund the BRI in the future. Chinese leaders see Africa mainly as a source of natural resources. China's fast-paced growth since the early 1990s has generated a voracious demand for oil and subsoil minerals. And Africa appeared a perfect fit since dominant multinationals had a weak hold on the continent, and Beijing could easily outbid them to gain equity stakes in mines and oil fields. According to the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, China loaned $152 billion to 49 African countries between 2000 and 2018. Chinese FDI in that period rose from $7.8 billion to $46 billion. On paper, China may seem to have got its money's worth. Merchandise trade between China and Africa rose from $107 billion to $204 billion in 2018, based on data provided by the Chinese government. For one thing, once China extended the credit or made the direct investments in mines, oil fields, or roads, it was at the mercy of the recipients, Africa's national governments and political elites. China has no power to prevent the nationalization of its investments or defaults on its loans. Not sure about that. China's gamble in Africa also flopped thanks to bad timing. Its foray into the continent coincided with the peak of the most recent commodity supercycle, skyrocketing prices of raw materials, this time driven by Chinese demand. Now that the coronavirus outbreak is about to devastate Africa's fragile economies and societies, China needs a pragmatic exit strategy. Beijing must realize that it is unlikely to recover most of its sunken investments or loans because of the economic impact of the virus on Africa. The only sensible policy flowing from such a reckoning is to write off its loans as a humanitarian gesture. But this dramatic step will be a bargain, since it will earn Beijing goodwill and the money that it has no realistic hope of recouping. Then, Daily Maverick, will we see a post-COVID China-Africa reset? First, internally, what will be the effect of the crisis on African governments, and particularly on the relationship between the state and the citizens? A good point. Secondly, externally, how will the relationship between China and other powers, specifically China, Africa and other powers, specifically China, alter in the aftermath? On the first question, the immediate answer depends in part on who appears to have done better in managing the COVID crisis. Unlike the Asian development experience, post-colonial African history saw a slide into militarism, autocracy, and incessant stability, not least because the government lacked the competition and competency to deliver prosperity. Good point. Chinese model comes at an immense political and economic price. This includes, but is not limited to, the cost of the exchange rate manipulation to remain competitive in trade, and continued infrastructure investment to drive demand for commodities, job creation, and urban expansions. These aren't costs that many African governments can afford to incur without falling ever deeper into a debt trap. Statist overreach by African governments mimicking the developed world's response in a developing world reality on behalf of elites can only have dramatic and negative economic consequences. The dilution of democracy suggests that investors will be less forthcoming absent constitutional legal safeguards, and donors are less likely to invest beyond humanitarian assistance. The political resilience of African citizenry also might well surprise in this regard. Africa is not China. African democracy is not a system which was once upon a time benevolently handed out by leaders. It is the system favoured by the vast majority of citizens, given the previous experience, and its freedoms have been hard fought for in most cases. Global growth, according to the IMF, is set to contract sharply by -3% in 2020. Sub-Saharan Africa's growth is predicted to fall by minus 1.4%, with Nigeria at minus 3.4% and South Africa at minus 5.8%, the two giants comprising 45% of regional economic output. The continent is likely to become increasingly debt-stressed as a consequence of COVID. Extent outside actors, and specifically Chinese institutions, are willing to renegotiate African debt. On April 15, the G20 agreed to do so until the end of the year, all except one, China. China loaned more than 120 billion to 67 mostly developing nations through its Belt and Road Initiative for infrastructure development. Beijing has, their report, caveated preferential loans such as those made by the Export-Import Bank of China for debt relief, thereby making a mockery of the G20 pledge. By continuing to demand interest payments on the loans, China will force poor nations to choose between servicing debts and importing essential goods such as food and medical supplies. Some BRI projects, such as the Standard Gauge Railway loans to Ethiopia and China, for example, are believed, since they are opaque arrangements, to carry interest rates of around 8%, double the cost of capital to the Chinese lenders. China has provided nearly half of all new loans to nations considered to be at risk of default. Ethiopia owes nearly 20% of its GDP to China, South Africa some 4%, and Kenya more than 11%. And this is what I was talking about in my article, The End of Vanity, China, Africa, Win-Win. And I was saying, let's turn to the defining engagement of the last 2 decades for Sub-Saharan Africa, the Sub-Saharan African-China relationship. I said the entire China-Africa relationship has been an extraordinary exercise in narrative framing and linguistic control, accompanied by a chorus of party hacks chirruping hosannas at every turn, amplifying largely meaningless feel-good phrases artfully placed in the mouths of our politicians and our newspapers. It is remarkable. I referenced the FOCAC 2018 Beijing summit, where Xi gave a warning which no one picked up, not even China specialists, as I've discovered, where he said funds for Africa are not for vanity projects. And then talking about the China emerging markets frontier feedback loop, which has undergone a trend reversal. And I was quoting an interview I'd had on Al Jazeera when I said China had a singular and positive influence in Africa, rebalanced the demand side for Africa's commodities, also bought those commodities on a long-term basis. It was this which triggered the African recovery some 2 decades ago. However, since then, a freewheeling China has favorited elites, has facilitated large-scale looting via inflated infrastructure, some of which were white elephants, and has lumped the African citizen with the tab. I said how this plays out now is the key to the Sino-African relation going forward. And I said then a Hambantota scenario would be problematic. That was 2018. And now indeed we've arrived at precisely that Hambantota moment. Basically, China has an option to buy sub-Saharan assets at fire sale prices because all the loans are in default. The terms of these debts are hidden precisely because they are so egregious. So now it's a very difficult moment. The BRI loans are not foreign aid. We need at least recoup principal and a moderate interest, the Chinese are saying. Let that sink in for those BRI partners who may have harbored some kind of wishful thinking about pandemic-linked debt relief from Beijing. So there we are. Currently, Nigeria has a curve with a steeper trajectory than the USA. This is COVID. According to The Economist, of 66 emerging countries with financial exposure, you can count Zambia, Angola, Tunisia, Gabon, Ghana, South Africa, Senegal, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda as the top 10 of those in Africa with most difficulties. Lopez Insights. This allows comparison across African countries on cases, deaths, recovered test data points, and see how they're doing since the day the first case was confirmed. That's from Mallet KS. Ethiopia is an outlier, and I'm still mystified by that. To date, South Africa has 6,336 confirmed cases of the novel coronavirus disease. The total number of deaths is 123. Reminder, with this number of dead, as a rule of thumb, South Africa has at least 12,000 infections 2 weeks ago. That's wildebeest. At this relatively early stage, South Africa appears to have a significantly younger age profile of deaths, HIV, tuberculosis, younger population, attack rate different. President Magufuli of Tanzania, have a listen if you understand Swahili to this short video. He's basically saying a papaya, a quail, and a goat tested positive for the virus at a Tanzanian lab, and called on the authorities to investigate sabotage at the national laboratory. The equipment or people may be compromised, and sometimes it can be sabotage, he said in a Swahili speech broadcast live through state-run TBC. According to Magufuli, a papaya, a quail, and a goat tested positive, and he suspects a dirty game in the laboratory. That means there is the possibility for technical errors, or these imported reagents have issues. Probably the technicians are also bought to mislead. He was swearing in the new Minister for Constitution and Legal Affairs and urged him to go and investigate if there is a criminal possibility at the National Laboratory and take action. On Sunday, he criticized a Muslim leader who on Friday shut a large mosque in Dar es Salaam as a precaution against the spread of the virus. It's strange to stop believers from entering a mosque which they built themselves. If you fear going there, let others go and pray. By the way, we are still in the elementary stage of the coronavirus. Magufuli also said Tanzania was in talks with Madagascar for a potion that the island nation claims cures COVID-19 patients within 10 days. First of all, we are looking in the rearview mirror. And as I said, the coronavirus doesn't deal with bullshit. And this is what this is. And we know what exponential propagation looks like in the real world. Nothing, 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 then cluster, 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 then boom. And it's going to boom right there. Tanzanian opposition stopped going to parliament after 3 MPs die. Tanzania's biggest opposition party asked its members to suspend attending parliament sessions after a minister became the 3rd lawmaker to die in 11 days. Boom, right there. That's probably a super spreading hotspot right there. South African All Share is down 11.82% year to date. Dollar Rand 18.874, but I expect the Rand now to start selling off with the renminbi. Egyptian pound 15.66, EGX30 down 26.94% year to date. Nigeria is facing significant external pressure. The IMF support of $3.4 billion is helpful, but unlikely to be enough to fully close the external financing gap. That's Elena Rybakova. Even assuming other multilateral lenders come through, how likely is large World Bank support without an IMF program? Nigeria's current account is likely to be in deficit despite sharp import contraction. Production limits under the OPEC Plus agreement plus lower oil prices will reduce goods exports by more than 40% in 2020. Rybakova again. Nigeria is continuing to face portfolio outflows since the second half of 2019. While estimating with precision foreign investor participation in central bank bills can be a challenge, we think that more outflows are to be expected. They can't even convert at the moment, having sold off their positions. Nigeria's reserve loss started well before COVID-19 and is likely to continue. What are the options? She says further reserve loss, FX adjustment, IMF, SBA, formal or informal capital controls. That's what's going to happen. As I said, on the 5th of March, a currency devaluation is now predicted and predictable. 2nd of March, I was writing about them as well. 9th of December, I was talking and saying it's time to big up the dosage of Quaaludes. We knew from then how this story would end. When the music stops, everyone will dash for the exit and the currency will collapse, just like it's collapsed in Lusaka. Nigerian All Shares down 14.24% year-to-date. Ghana Stock Exchange down 6.93% year-to-date. The Maldives tourism industry accounts for 28% of GDP, has been hit hard by the pandemic. The tourism minister says right now we're in the middle of the storm and hopes to welcome back visitors by Q3. It's not going to happen. In fact, I think it's stopped out all year, right through to December 2021 is my prediction. Zambia's inflation surges as currency tumbles. The kwacha has plunged 24% this year, the worst performing currency in Africa. IMF reckons the GDP will contract by 3.5% this year. I wrote about them in October when I said they're the canary in the coal mine, and that it would not be an exaggeration to say we're staring into the abyss of a zombie apocalypse. Zimbabwe government close to collapse as Incube sends plea for cash. Africa Confidential in an extended mea culpa. On behalf of President Mnangagwa's government, Mutuli Cube has written to the international financial institutions in Washington saying it takes responsibility for the recent policy missteps during late 2019, which have led to inflation currently running at an annual rate of over 500% per year. Then writes that the government and the economy are near to collapse, with the coronavirus pandemic dealing the final blow. They have not bothered to respond. Zimbabwe is in a political and not an economic policy crisis. Without credible change on that level, nothing else will move, concluded the official. 21st of January last year, I was saying Zimbabwe is at a tipping point moment. It's been tipping for a year. And basically the mind game that ZANU-PF played on its citizens has evaporated, in my opinion, in a puff of smoke. This is an interesting photo. Ethiopian traders or diplomats circa 180 is illustrated in scenes from Amaravati. These East Africans were probably from Aksum, whose merchants were important participants in the trade between Roman Egypt and India via William Dalrymple. Between 2015 and 2019, daily newspapers in circulation have collapsed by 21%. That's from Mir Thacker and speaks to the Schumpeter moment. Today was the highest percentage TPR we've had this week at 3.4%, Dr. Ahmed Kelebi, who tends to interpret everything very optimistically. The problem here is the level of tests. So look at the deaths, apply the ratio, and you're going to see that this is much more widespread than the tests are showing. Flooding has submerged homes, displacing thousands after the River Nzoia broke its banks. You can't make this up, can you? Locusts, COVID-19, debt crisis, and now floods. Kenya Red Cross says 1,800 families have been made homeless after heavy rainfall caused flooding and landslides across the region. Nairobi All Share is down 16.06% year-to-date. NSE20 is down 26.23% year-to-date. Thank you for listening.